The scent of brittle paper and decaying leather was the only perfume Ilara Vance knew. It clung to her clothes, her skin, her hair, a constant reminder of the quiet, ordered world she had built within the four walls of her workshop. Her fingers, stained with the faint, ghostly imprints of ink and glue, moved with a surgeon's precision over the broken spine of a 19th-century poetry collection. Mending the broken spine of a forgotten story was the only form of intimacy she allowed herself. Each careful stitch, each delicate application of adhesive, was a prayer for something broken to be made whole again. In this dusty sanctuary, surrounded by the silent ghosts of 1,000 narratives, she could control the chaos, piece by piece. It was here, in the patient restoration of things others had discarded, that she found a fragile semblance of peace, a way to quiet the relentless echo of a life that had shattered long ago. If you want to know what happens when this carefully mended life is shattered by an unpayable debt, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. We continue. Ilara Vance, at 22, was a woman made of quiet spaces and gentle movements. She lived in a small, cluttered apartment directly above her workshop, a nest built in the heart of Boston's historic district. Cobblestone streets whispered tales of centuries past beneath her window, a stark contrast to the city's glass towers that loomed in the distance, alien monoliths from a world she observed but never entered. Her life was a meticulously curated museum of one. The furniture was old and worn, the teacups were chipped, and every object held a story that was not her own. She preferred the company of these inanimate objects, for they demanded nothing but her care and could never betray her with the violent unpredictability of emotion. She was a relic herself, preserving a way of life that was fading, just as she preserved the books that were her only companions. The ghost of her sister, Lily, lived in the silence between the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the soft rustle of turning pages. The memory was a permanent fracture in the foundation of her soul, a wound that never fully healed. Lily had been all vibrant color and reckless passion, a wildfire of a girl who loved with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified Ilara. That love, a whirlwind romance with a man as wild as she was, had ended in a symphony of screeching tires and shattering glass on a rain-slicked highway. The silence that followed that night was the loudest sound Ilara had ever heard. From that wreckage, she had salvaged a single devastating lesson. Intense emotion was a precursor to destruction. Passion was a fire that consumed everything in its path, and she had resolved to live her life in the cool, safe ashes. Her virginity was not a treasure to be given away, but the last unbroken seal on a vault of carefully guarded emotions. It was not born of religious conviction or moral superiority, but of a profound instinctual terror. To let someone past that final defense would be to grant them access to the fragile, fragmented core of her being, the part of her she kept hidden even from herself. It was a shield, a symbol of the emotional and physical sanctum she refused to let anyone breach. She had seen what happened when you gave your body and soul to another. You gave them the power to destroy you. Men would look at her with a fleeting curiosity, but her quiet reserve was a fortress wall they could not scale. She preferred it that way. The risk of connection was a price she was no longer willing to pay, for she had already seen it cost her sister everything. Her days were measured in the delicate turn of a page and the slow drying of binding glue. She would wake with the pale morning light, descend the creaking stairs to her workshop, and lose herself in the methodical rhythm of her craft until dusk. Painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and soft grey. Her life was a loop, a perfectly preserved narrative with no new chapters. She was a curator of other people's passions, a ghost in her own narrative, existing in the margins of stories that had already been told, while she breathed life back into the faded gilt and crumbling pages of forgotten romances and epic adventures. Her own heart remained a locked, unread volume on a dusty shelf. This controlled solitude was a choice, a necessary anesthetic for a soul that felt too much, yet an aching, hollow void grew in the stillness, a silent scream for a story of her own. This self-imposed exile was complicated by a singular, fragile tether to the world, her grandmother. The woman who had raised her after Lily's death was now fading, her body a frail vessel succumbing to the slow, relentless tide of illness. The scent of Ilara's workshop was now constantly mingled with the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital corridors she walked twice a week. The mounting medical bills were a physical weight, a stack of white envelopes on her small kitchen table that felt like headstones marking the grave of her meager savings. Her duty to her grandmother was the one emotion she could not suppress, a fierce, protective love that was both her greatest strength and her most terrifying vulnerability. It was this love that threatened to crack the very foundations of the fortress she had so carefully constructed around her heart. As night fell over Boston, the city lights began to glitter like a sea of cold, distant stars. Ilara stood by her window, looking down at the empty street below. She was surrounded by beautifully restored volumes, their stories whole again under her care, yet her own soul felt like a manuscript, with its most vital pages torn out. The quiet of her apartment was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, amplifying the frantic beat of her own anxious heart. She was trapped, imprisoned by a past she could not outrun, a present defined by duty and fear, and a future that seemed to be shrinking with every new medical bill that arrived. A profound loneliness settled over her, as heavy and suffocating as a winter shroud, and she felt a desperate, terrifying premonition that something had to break. The historic district where Ilara lived and worked was a pocket of preserved time, a stubborn ghost resisting the city's relentless march toward the future. The narrow cobblestone streets, worn smooth by centuries of footfalls and carriage wheels, were an intricate network of veins carrying the slow, quiet blood of the past. Brick townhouses, with their wrought-iron fences and gas-style lamps, stood shoulder to shoulder like aging sentinels, their windows watching the world with a weary indifference. This was Ilara's world, a place of texture and history, where the air itself seemed thick with forgotten stories. Yet, just beyond the rooftops, the needle-sharp tips of glass and steel skyscrapers pierced the sky. They were monuments to a different kind of existence, cold, ambitious, and impersonal, a world of ruthless efficiency that felt both alien and threatening, a constant, silent reminder of how fragile her own small corner of existence truly was. Her grandmother's apartment, just a few blocks away, was the heart of this fading world. It was a museum of a life lived, every surface covered with faded photographs in silver frames, delicate porcelain figurines, and hand-crocheted doilies that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The air was heavy with the scent of boiled tea and old wood, a comforting aroma that was now tinged with the sharp, medicinal odor of illness. This space, once a sanctuary of warmth and memory, had begun to feel like a shrine to things that were ending. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed to count down a finite number of seconds, and the slow creep of dust along the windowsills mirrored the slow, inexorable decline of the woman who was Ilara's only anchor. The traditions held within these walls were both a comfort and a cage, a legacy of expectations she felt honor-bound to uphold. Twice a week, she would sit by her grandmother's bed, the soft light of the afternoon filtering through the lace curtains. She would read aloud from worn poetry books, her voice a low murmur against the labored sound of the old woman's breathing. "You are a good girl, Ilara," her grandmother would whisper, her hand a fragile, papery thing in Ilara's own. "But you are too alone. A woman needs a husband, a protector. Your sister, she chose passion. It was a fire that burned too bright. You must choose security, child. Find a good, steady man who can care for you." The words were meant as a loving warning, a plea for Ilara to avoid the fate that had befallen Lily, but to Ilara they felt like a sentence. They reinforced the grim lesson she had already learned, that her own desires were dangerous and that safety lay in suppression. This pressure was compounded by the growing stack of white envelopes on her kitchen table. Each one was a harbinger of dread, a formal, impersonal demand from a world that did not care about love or duty, only numbers. The hospital letterhead was crisp and official, the figures inside stark and unforgiving. She would trace the digits with her finger, the sums so large they felt unreal, like a currency from a foreign land. Her work, her passion, which brought in just enough to cover her modest rent and supplies, was a pittance against this rising tide of debt. The meticulous, patient craft of restoring old books belonged to a slower, quieter era. It was no match for the brutal mathematics of modern medicine. The debt was a physical weight, a constant pressure in her chest that made it difficult to breathe, a silent scream in the quiet of her workshop. Her sanctuary was no longer a place of peace. The familiar scent of aging paper and leather binding glue now mingled with the phantom smell of antiseptic hospital corridors. As she carefully stitched a torn page or regilded a faded cover, her mind was not on the story held within the book, but on the terrifying narrative being written by the mounting bills. The tools in her hands, once instruments of creation and solace, now felt inadequate, like trying to mend a gaping wound with a single thread. The silence of the workshop, once a comforting blanket, now amplified the frantic, panicked rhythm of her thoughts. The very walls that had protected her from the world's chaos now felt like they were closing in. The shelves of silent, sleeping books, a gallery of witnesses to her growing desperation and powerlessness. Her isolation became a self-fulfilling prophecy. On her walks to the market or the hospital, she would see people her age gathered in the warm glow of cafes, their laughter echoing in the street. She would watch couples stroll hand in hand, their easy intimacy a language she had never learned to speak. A sharp, painful pang of longing would pierce through her defenses, a ghost of the life she might have had. But she would quickly push it down, burying it under layers of practicality and fear. Connection was a luxury she couldn't afford, emotionally or financially. Her duty was to her grandmother, her focus on survival. She had convinced herself that this solitude was a choice, a noble sacrifice. But in the lonely hours of the night, she knew the truth. It was a prison she had built for herself, and the key had been lost long ago. The memory of her sister was a constant cautionary tale, reinforced by her grandmother's sorrowful reminiscences. Lily loved with her whole heart, she would say, her eyes distant. She held nothing back, but the world breaks things that are so wide open. This family mythology painted Lily's passionate love not as a beautiful, tragic romance, but as a fatal character flaw, a reckless indulgence that had led directly to her demise. Ilara had internalized this narrative completely. It was the bedrock of her identity. Every potential suitor, every fleeting moment of attraction was filtered through the lens of this tragedy. To feel desire was to stand at the edge of the same cliff from which her sister had fallen. And so she had turned her back on the precipice, choosing to live in the flat, barren plains of safety, never realizing how much of herself she was leaving behind. The phone call came on a grey Tuesday afternoon, the rain outside streaking the workshop windows like tears. It was Dr. Alistair, his voice calm, professional, and devastatingly clinical. Her grandmother's condition had worsened. There was an experimental treatment, a new procedure that offered a sliver of hope, a fragile chance. But it was not covered by insurance, and the cost was astronomical, a figure so immense that Ilara felt the air leave her lungs in a silent gasp. The doctor's words became a dull, meaningless hum in her ear. All she could hear was the finality in his tone, the unspoken reality that hope had a price tag she could never hope to meet. When she hung up the phone, the receiver felt as heavy as a stone, and the silence that rushed back in was absolute and crushing. That night, she stood motionless in the center of her small apartment. The city outside glittered with a cold, indifferent beauty, a universe of 1,000,000 lives moving forward while hers had ground to a halt. The weight of it all, the debt, the diagnosis, the years of self-denial, crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She was trapped by her love for her grandmother, trapped by the ghost of her sister, trapped by a financial reality that was as unyielding as a granite wall. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself as a wave of utter, soul-crushing despair washed over her. For the first time, the quiet, ordered life she had so carefully constructed felt not like a fortress, but like a tomb. She was buried alive, and she was running out of air. A terrifying clarity emerged from the depths of her despair. Her craft, her quiet dignity, her moral fortitude, none of it was enough. The world she inhabited, the old world of honor and patient work, could not save her grandmother. The new world, the world of unforgiving numbers and ruthless transactions, was demanding a payment she did not possess. The path her grandmother had always advocated for, finding a man, seeking security, now echoed in her mind with a grim, pragmatic resonance. It was a future she had always rejected as a form of surrender, a betrayal of her own quiet independence. But as she sat on the cold floor, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the spectre of a devastating future, she understood that she was out of options. Something had to be sacrificed, something had to break. Julian Croft existed 40 floors above the city, in a world of silent, polished surfaces and cold, clean lines. His office was a glass cage suspended in the sky, offering a panoramic, godlike view of Boston spread out below. He could see the tangled, historic streets of Ilara's neighborhood, a quaint, inefficient maze of brick and cobblestone that he viewed with the detached curiosity of a biologist studying a specimen under a microscope. He was known in the financial world only as the architect, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. He didn't build, he deconstructed. He found the flaws in sprawling corporate empires and, with the surgical precision of a master demolitions expert, brought them to their knees, profiting from their perfectly engineered collapse. His power was not in creation, but in the cold, calculated art of erasure. This emotional sterility was a fortress, built brick by painful brick after a devastating betrayal years ago. The woman he had loved, the only person he had ever allowed into the fragile architecture of his heart, had used that access to shatter his world. She had conspired with a rival, gutting his family's company and leaving him with the public wreckage of his own naivete. From those ashes, Julian had rebuilt himself into something invulnerable, a man made of contracts and clauses, who saw emotion as a liability and trust as a fool's currency. The floor-to-ceiling windows of his office were a perfect metaphor for his existence. He could observe the entirety of the human experience, the chaos, the joy, the pain, without ever having to feel its messy, unpredictable touch. He was a spectator to a world he no longer believed in. The call from Dr. Alistair had left Ilara hollowed out, a fragile shell of a person navigating a world that had suddenly lost all its color. She drove through the rain-slicked streets in a daze, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers, a monotonous, hypnotic beat against the frantic, screaming silence in her mind. The doctor's words, experimental, no guarantees, significant cost, were a cruel litany of impossible hopes and concrete despair. The city lights blurred through her tear-filled eyes, transforming into abstract streaks of neon and gold. She was so lost in the suffocating fog of her grief and fear that she barely registered the stop sign, her foot pressing the accelerator instead of the brake, propelling her small, aging sedan into an intersection and directly into the path of a phantom moving through the night. The sound was not a loud crash, but a sickening, grinding tear of metal, a sound that ripped through the quiet cocoon of her car and jolted her violently back to reality. Her head snapped forward, and for a moment, the world was a silent, black and white photograph. Then, the sounds rushed back in, the hiss of the rain on hot metal, the faint, insistent ticking of her own engine, and the thunderous, terrified pounding of her own heart. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she saw what she had hit. It wasn't just a car, it was a sculpture of midnight blue steel, a vehicle so sleek and impossibly perfect, it looked as though it had been carved from a single block of obsidian. It was a predator of a machine, and her small, dented sedan was a wounded sparrow caught in its path. The driver's side door of the Aston Martin opened with a silent, hydraulic hiss. A man emerged, not with the frantic anger she expected, but with a chilling, unnatural calm. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to repel the rain, each drop sliding off the expensive fabric without leaving a mark. His face was a mask of cold, aristocratic beauty, his features sharp and defined, his eyes a pale, icy grey that seemed to absorb the dim city light and give nothing back. He didn't look at the damage to his car first. He looked at her, his gaze not accusatory or angry, but something far more unnerving, analytical. It was the look of a man assessing a problem, a miscalculation in an otherwise perfect equation, and she felt herself shrink under its weight, reduced to nothing more than a variable. Trembling, Ilara fumbled with her door handle and stepped out into the cold, wet air. The rain immediately began to plaster her thin cardigan to her skin, but she barely felt the chill. Her entire being was focused on the deep, elegant scar her car had gouged into the side of the magnificent vehicle. It was a wound that screamed of money she didn't have, a debt that felt instantly and insurmountably larger than even the mountain of medical bills waiting for her at home. A sob caught in her throat, a pathetic choked sound. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible over the drumming of the rain. I didn't see you." She looked up at the man, her eyes pleading for an ounce of understanding, of human compassion, but his expression remained a slate of unreadable, impassive control. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his gaze finally shifting to the damage. He ran a long-fingered hand over the gash, not with sentiment, but with the detached air of an appraiser examining a flawed diamond. "Apologies are an inefficient form of currency," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that cut through the night air with unnerving clarity. It was devoid of warmth, a precisely modulated instrument of command. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and produced a wallet, from which he extracted a single stark white business card. He held it out to her. "My office will be in contact with your insurance company tomorrow to discuss the settlement. I trust you have one." The statement was not a question, but a command, an assumption of a world of order and responsibility that she had just violently disrupted. Ilara took the card, her trembling fingers brushing against his for a fleeting, electric second. The cardstock was thick and heavy, the edges razor-sharp. It felt alien in her hand, a piece of his world, a world of power, wealth, and consequence. There was no name on it, only a single stylized C embossed in silver and a phone number. For a long moment, she just stood there in the downpour, clutching the card as if it were a verdict. He turned without another word, got back into his car, and drove away, the purr of the engine, a deep, menacing sound that faded into the night. She was left alone on the wet asphalt, the rain washing over her, feeling as though she hadn't just been in an accident, but had collided with a different, more dangerous species of man entirely. As the Aston Martin moved silently through the city streets, Julian Croft glanced at the rearview mirror, the image of the small rain-soaked woman already receding into the blur of lights. He should have been irritated, furious even, at the violation of his perfectly ordered world, at the blemish on a machine built for perfection. Instead, he felt a flicker of something else, a dissonant chord of curiosity. It wasn't just the terror in her eyes that had registered, but the profound, crushing despair beneath it. He had seen fear countless times in boardrooms and negotiations. It was a tool he wielded with expertise, but this was different. It was a pure, unadulterated sorrow, and mixed within it, he had seen a fragile, stubborn flicker of dignity. She was an anomaly, a damaged, rare book written in a language he had long since forgotten, and the cold strategist in him was unexpectedly intrigued. Back in her workshop, the scent of old paper and glue did nothing to soothe her shattered nerves. The small white card sat on her workbench, a stark, foreign object amidst the familiar, comforting clutter of her tools. It seemed to glow in the dim light, a beacon of a world she was not equipped to handle. Every instinct screamed at her to throw it away, to pretend the night had never happened. But the image of that cold, impassive face and the memory of that deep, emotionless voice were seared into her mind. This was not a problem that could be ignored. The card was a summons, a key to a door she never wanted to open. With a shaking hand and a heart heavy with dread, she picked up her phone, knowing that the call she was about to make would irrevocably alter the course of her quiet, carefully guarded life. The first event was a charity gala held in a restored art museum, a place where priceless artifacts were encased in climate-controlled glass boxes. Ilara felt like one of them, a carefully presented object, out of her natural element and on display for appraisal. The dress Julian's assistant had provided was a sheath of dark silk that felt alien against her skin, a stark contrast to her usual soft cottons and wools. As they entered, a wave of sound and light washed over her. The murmur of 100 conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, the blinding flash of a photographer's bulb. Julian's hand rested on the small of her back, a point of searing heat. It was not a gesture of affection, but of possession, a firm, proprietary touch that guided her through the glittering crowd, as if she were a valuable, albeit temporary, acquisition. The pressure was a constant reminder of their contract, a physical manifestation of the debt she owed. He moved through the opulent ballroom with the predatory grace of a panther, his presence parting the sea of influential guests. He introduced her with a practiced ease, his voice a smooth, polished veneer over the cold steel beneath. "This is Ilara," was all he would say. the absence of a last name or a story making her a beautiful, intriguing mystery. She would smile, a fragile, trembling curve of her lips, and murmur polite greetings, her mind a chaotic storm of inadequacy. These people spoke of stock portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons, a language as foreign to her as ancient Greek. She felt Julian's gaze on her, coolly analytical, assessing her performance. She was a book he was reading, and he was searching for the flaws in her binding, the tells that would reveal the forgery of their connection. During a lull in the orchestrated chaos, he led her to a secluded terrace overlooking a manicured garden. The cool night air was a welcome relief, a balm on her overheated skin. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the distant music a faint thrum beneath the chirping of crickets. "You are a convincing actress," he finally said, his voice devoid of praise. It was a simple statement of fact. "You wear your terror well. It reads as shyness. They find it charming." His words were a splash of cold water, a reminder that this was all a transaction. She looked at his chiseled profile, silhouetted against the city lights, and felt a surge of something other than fear, a flicker of defiance. "Perhaps it is not an act," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Perhaps I am simply terrified of this world you call normal." His gaze shifted to her then, a flicker of genuine surprise in his icy eyes before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. The car ride home was an exercise in suffocating silence. The interior of the Aston Martin was a cocoon of black leather and polished chrome, smelling faintly of him, a clean, sharp scent of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and cold. Ilara stared out the window at the blurred city lights, her reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the world rushing by. She could feel his presence beside her, an intense gravitational pull she fought to resist. "Why do you do it?" she asked, the question breaking the silence so abruptly it felt like a physical impact. He didn't have to ask what she meant. "Because empires are fragile," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "They are built on hubris and flawed foundations. I simply find the cracks and apply the necessary pressure. It is the most honest form of business there is." His cynicism was a physical thing, an armor he wore as impeccably as his tailored suits. "There is no honor in destruction," she countered softly, thinking of her own work, of the patient, loving act of mending what was broken. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Honor is a luxury for those who have never had everything taken from them. I trade in reality, Miss Vance, and the reality is that everything and everyone has a breaking point. It is simply a matter of finding it." His words were a veiled threat, a reminder of her own precarious position. She was another flawed foundation he was testing, and she felt a cold dread creep into her heart as she wondered just how much pressure he thought she could withstand before she, too, would shatter completely. Their arrangement continued in a series of similar performances, quiet dinners at exclusive restaurants where the food was more art than sustenance, stiff appearances at corporate functions, and one tense weekend at his sterile, minimalist estate in the country. With each passing event, the line between the performance and reality began to blur for Ilara. She learned to anticipate his moods from the subtle tightening of his jaw, to recognize the rare moments when his guard slipped. She saw him not just as a monster, but as a man encased in ice, and she began to wonder what fire had been extinguished to leave him so cold. The accidental brush of his fingers against hers as he passed her a wineglass sent a jolt through her that was both terrifying and undeniably thrilling, a forbidden warmth spreading through her veins. One evening, as they sat in his cavernous library, a room with thousands of books that looked as if they had never been opened, she spoke of her grandmother. She described the woman's fading memories, the way her stories of the past were becoming fragmented and confused, like a beloved book with its pages falling out of order. As she spoke, she forgot who she was talking to, the raw, unfiltered grief pouring out of her. She expected him to be dismissive, to cut her off with some cold, pragmatic statement. Instead, he was utterly still, his gaze fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. When she finally fell silent, her cheeks wet. With tears she hadn't realized she'd shed, he didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply said, "My father collected first editions. He said they were the only things that never lied." It was the first piece of his own story he had ever offered, a tiny, fractured glimpse into the past that had shaped him. In that moment the power dynamic shifted, however infinitesimally. She saw not the architect, the corporate raider, but a man who understood loss, a man who had also loved something that was gone. A fragile, tentative connection formed between them in the silence of that room, a single, delicate thread woven from shared grief. It was more dangerous than any of his cold commands or calculated touches, because it made him real. It made her question everything she thought she knew about him, and more terrifyingly, it made her question the carefully constructed walls she had built around her own heart, which were beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a cage. This newfound complexity made their public charade both easier and infinitely more difficult. The feigned smiles began to feel less forced, the staged affection charged with a genuine, unspoken current. At a high-stakes corporate event, a rival of Julian's, a bloated man with cruel eyes made a veiled public remark about Julian's past betrayal, alluding to the woman who had ruined him. Ilara, filled with a sudden, fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed, stepped forward. With a calm, quiet dignity, she dismantled the man's insinuation, not with anger, but with a sharp, intelligent defense of Julian's character, praising his integrity in a way that left the entire room silent and the rivals sputtering. She had defended his honor, and the shock on Julian's face was a visible crack in his impenetrable facade. Later that night, he cornered her on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face. The city glittered below them, a galaxy of indifferent lights. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice rough, stripped of its usual control. "That was not in the contract." "You were being attacked," she said simply, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "It was an instinct." "I don't pay for your instincts," he snarled, stepping closer, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I pay for your compliance." The raw emotion in his eyes, anger, confusion, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable, was a revelation. He was not just observing her, she was affecting him, getting under his skin in a way he could not control. This realization was a spark in the volatile air between them. The carefully maintained distance they had preserved for weeks evaporated in an instant. He reached out, his hand tangling in her hair, and his mouth came down on hers. The kiss was not gentle or tender. It was a desperate, angry collision. It was a kiss of frustration, of a man warring with himself, of two broken, lonely souls crashing into each other in the darkness. It was everything Ilara had ever feared, a whirlwind of intense, chaotic emotion that threatened to sweep her away. But as his lips moved against hers, a shocking, traitorous thought pierced through her panic. For the first time in her life, she didn't want to be safe. She wanted to be consumed by the storm. Just as quickly as it began, it was over. He pulled back as if he'd been burned, a look of self-loathing twisting his features. He turned away from her without a word, leaving her alone on the balcony, her lips tingling, her body trembling, her entire world tilted on its axis. The kiss had shattered the contract, replacing its cold, clear terms with a messy, terrifying and exhilarating ambiguity. She had touched the fire she had spent her entire life avoiding, and instead of being destroyed, she had felt an incandescent, terrifying flicker of life. The carefully ordered narrative of her existence had been irrevocably torn, and she had no idea how to mend it. The ghost of her sister's choices no longer felt like a warning, but like a question she was finally brave enough to ask herself. The fragile truce between them was broken. The days that followed were thick with a strained, humming tension. They avoided being alone, their interactions reverting to the cold formality of their initial agreement, but the memory of the kiss hung in the air between them, a silent, charged accusation. Ilara felt as though she were living a double life, her quiet days in the workshop a world away from the emotional minefield of her evenings with Julian. The desire he had awakened in her was a constant, low-level fever, a secret shame, and a thrilling discovery. She was becoming a stranger to herself, a woman who craved the very danger she had built her life to avoid. She was caught in a current, being pulled further and further from the safe shores of her past. The call from the hospital came like a death knell, shattering the precarious new reality she was navigating. Her grandmother's condition had taken a drastic turn. The only remaining option was the experimental surgery Dr. Alistair had mentioned before, a radical, high-risk procedure with an astronomical price tag and no guarantee of success. The funds from her initial agreement with Julian, which had seemed like a fortune, were a mere drop in the ocean compared to this new, terrifying figure. The hope that had been a fragile seedling in her heart was crushed under the weight of this new despair. She was back where she started, only this time the stakes were infinitely higher. It wasn't just about managing a decline, it was about buying a chance at life itself. She went to him that evening, finding him in his office, the city lights painting patterns on the polished floor. She stood before his massive desk, a small, desperate supplicant in his kingdom of glass and steel. With a voice that trembled but did not break, she explained the situation, laying bare her terror and her helplessness. She didn't ask for his help, she simply stated the facts, the raw, brutal mathematics of her predicament. He listened in that unnerving silence of his face an unreadable mask, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. The silence stretched on for an eternity, each second a turn of the screw in her chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, calm, and utterly devastating. "I will cover it," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Every cost, the surgery, the aftercare, all of it. The debt for the car will be considered paid in full. You will be free." A wave of dizzying, disbelieving relief washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. But it was fleeting, extinguished by the cold, transactional look in his eyes. He rose from his chair and walked around the desk, stopping just before her. He was not looking at her with pity or compassion, but with the cool, appraising gaze of a collector who had finally found the one priceless artifact he was willing to pay any price to acquire. "But this new arrangement requires a different form of payment," he continued, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. "The performance is over, Ilara. The pretense is done. I will give you your grandmother's life, and in return, you will give me one night. Not as an actress playing a part, but as yourself. You will give me the one thing you have guarded so fiercely." He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was both intimate and terrifyingly impersonal. "You will give me your surrender." The proposition landed not as a suggestion, but as a final, unassailable clause in a contract she had no choice but to sign. Her choice was gone. It was her soul for her grandmother's, a transaction that would either save her or destroy her completely. The phone felt cold and heavy in her hand, a conduit to a world she had vowed never to enter. After she made the call, a profound, chilling calm settled over her. His only reply had been a quiet, "Come," followed by the address to his penthouse, a location that sounded more like a constellation than a place on Earth. She moved through her workshop with the serene, deliberate motions of a sleepwalker. She ran her fingers over the spine of a half-mended copy of Wuthering Heights, a story of a destructive passion she had always judged, but now, terrifyingly, was beginning to understand. She was not just accepting a transaction. She was stepping into the pages of a story she could not control, and for the first time, she was not afraid of the ending. This was her transgression, a quiet, internal rebellion against the ghost of her sister and the tyranny of her own fear. It was an act of sacrifice, but a terrifying, exhilarating part of her knew it was also an act of self-discovery. The taxi ride through the city was a journey through a different dimension. The familiar, historic streets of her neighborhood, with their warm, gaslit glow, gave way to the cold electric canyons of the financial district. The buildings grew taller, sharper, their glass facades reflecting a distorted, fractured version of the world. Ilara watched her own pale reflection in the window, a ghost being transported to the underworld. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were observing the life of another woman, a character in a book whose fate was already written. The taxi ascended the spiraling ramp to Julian's building, a modern-day Tower of Babel, and she felt herself rising above the world she knew, leaving behind the safety of the ground for the precarious, uncertain air. Every foot of elevation was another step away from the girl who mended books and a step closer to the woman who was about to sell her soul. He was waiting for her when the elevator doors whispered open directly into his penthouse. The space was vast, silent, and stark, a cathedral of minimalism. Walls of glass revealed the entire city glittering below like a carpet of fallen stars. There was no clutter, no history, no warmth, only clean lines, polished chrome, and the deep, silent black of the night sky. Julian stood in the center of the room, not wearing one of his power suits, but simple dark trousers and a soft grey cashmere sweater. The casual attire was more disarming than any armor of formality. He didn't speak, merely watched her as she stepped out of the elevator. Her simple dress and worn cardigan, a stark, fragile contrast to the cold perfection of his world. The silence between them was not empty. It was a physical entity, heavy with unspoken agreements, with fear, and with a terrible magnetic anticipation that made the air hum. Without a word, he turned and led her toward the bedroom. The room was even more stark than the living area, dominated by a large, low bed, dressed in crisp white linens and a single wall of floor-to-ceiling glass that made it feel as if they were floating in the night sky. The city lights were the only illumination, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. It was the antithesis of her own cluttered, cozy bedroom, a space designed not for comfort, but for observation. He stopped by the window, his back to her, looking down at the world he commanded. "There are no pretenses here, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, rough sound that was absorbed by the silence. "No audience, no contract, just the terms we agreed upon." His words were a final, brutal confirmation, stripping away any last hope of sentiment, leaving only the cold, hard reality of their bargain. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She knew this was the moment of surrender, the payment in full. With trembling fingers, she began to unbutton her cardigan, letting it slide from her shoulders onto the cold, polished floor. Then came the dress, the simple cotton garment she had worn for comfort, now feeling like the last layer of a self she was about to discard. She stood before him in the dim, shifting light from the city, her nakedness feeling less like a seduction and more like a final, desperate offering. She was a book stripped of its binding, her story laid bare, vulnerable to the judgment of its reader. She did not try to hide herself. She met his reflection in the glass, her gaze steady, her terror a silent prayer. This was her choice. This was her sacrifice. This was the unpayable debt being settled. He turned slowly, and the look in his eyes was not the triumphant gaze of a predator, nor the cold assessment of a businessman. It was something she had never seen before, a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. The control he wore like a second skin had fractured, revealing the wounded man beneath. He took a step toward her, his hand lifting as if to touch her, then hesitating, the motion suspended in the charged air between them. "I have destroyed companies worth billions with less thought than I am giving this moment," he whispered, his voice hoarse with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a confession, an admission that this transaction, this intimate acquisition, was affecting him in a way his calculated corporate demolitions never had. In her complete vulnerability, she had somehow found a way past his impenetrable defenses, and he seemed as terrified by that discovery as she was. He closed the distance between them, his fingers finally making contact with her skin, tracing the line of her collarbone. His touch was not demanding or rough, but shockingly gentle, almost reverent, as if he were handling a priceless, fragile artifact. He lowered his head, and his lips found hers, not with the angry fire of their first kiss on the balcony, but with a deep, searching tenderness that shattered her completely. It was a kiss of shared loneliness, of two broken souls recognizing their fractures in each other. She responded with all the pent-up fear, grief, and nascent desire she had suppressed for a lifetime. Her surrender was absolute, a yielding not just of her body, but of the fortress she had built around her heart. She was falling, and for the first time, she was not afraid of the impact, because he was falling with her. They moved to the bed, a slow, dreamlike procession. The act itself was a quiet, desperate conversation held in a language of touch and breath. For Ilara, it was a cataclysm of sensation, a breaking and remaking of her entire world. The pain was sharp but fleeting, eclipsed by an overwhelming wave of emotional release that was so profound it felt like grief. Tears streamed silently from her eyes, tears for her sister, for her grandmother, for the lonely girl she had been for so long. It was not an act of passion in the way Lily would have understood it. It was a deeper, more solemn communion, an exchange of solitude. As her body finally yielded to a pleasure she had never known, a pleasure so intense it bordered on pain, She felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly, and finally free. In the breathless aftermath, as they lay tangled in the white sheets, the city lights their only witness, he held her with a fierce protective grip, as if he were afraid she might shatter. He buried his face in her hair, and his body shuddered with a single contained sob. It was a sound of such profound, ancient grief that it pierced her to the core. Her name was Catherine, he whispered against her skin, the name a ghost he hadn't spoken aloud in years. She didn't just take the company, she took the man I was supposed to be. It was the ultimate reveal, the key to the locked room of his soul. He had not just taken her virginity, he had given her his most painful secret in return. The transaction was complete, but the currency had changed. It was no longer about money or bodies. It was about the trading of wounds. They lay in silence for a long time, the rhythm of their breathing slowly sinking in the quiet room. The city below continued its relentless, glittering dance, unaware of the profound shift that had occurred 40 floors above it. Ilara looked at the man beside her, at the harsh lines of his face softened by sleep and vulnerability, and she felt not shame or regret, but a strange, aching sense of belonging. She had walked into his sterile, empty world to settle a debt, but in the act of transgression, they had created something new in the ruins of their pasts. It was not love, not yet, but it was a fragile, terrifying connection forged in shared darkness. She had given him her surrender, and in return, he had shown her his soul. The debt was paid, but a new, far more complex one had just been incurred. The dawn broke over Boston, painting the sky in pale, indifferent shades of grey and rose. Ilara awoke to the deafening silence of Julian's penthouse. She was alone. The vast bed, with its sea of crisp white sheets, felt like an icy raft in an empty ocean. The warmth of his body, the ghost of his presence, was already gone, leaving behind only the faint, clean scent of him on the pillow. The intimacy of the night had evaporated with the darkness, leaving the cold, transactional truth of their bargain exposed in the morning light. On the polished black nightstand, an envelope lay waiting. Inside, there was no note, no word of farewell, only a printed confirmation of a wire transfer to the hospital, a sum so large it looked like a telephone number. The debt was settled. She dressed in the clothes of the woman she had been yesterday, but they felt like a costume on a stranger. Returning to her workshop was like stepping back in time, a jarring re-entry into a world that no longer fit. The familiar, comforting scent of aging paper and binding glue seemed to mock her, a fragrance of an innocence she no longer possessed. Every object, the worn wooden workbench, the neat rows of mending tools, the stacks of silent waiting books, was a relic from a life that was no longer hers. She caught her reflection in the dark glass of a framed print and saw a woman with haunted eyes, her face pale and etched with a knowledge she had never sought. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in her stomach. It was not just shame for the act itself, but a deeper, more confusing shame for the part of her that had felt a profound, shattering connection to him in the darkness, a connection he had clearly discarded with the rising sun. 40 floors above the city, Julian Croft stood before the wall of glass in his office, a sentinel surveying a kingdom that suddenly felt empty. He had won. The contract was complete, the terms met, the debt paid. He had intended the night to be the final logical step in his acquisition, a cold confirmation of his belief that everything, even a woman's deeply held principles, had a price. Instead, her quiet, trembling surrender had been a disarming act of war against his cynicism. It had breached defenses he had spent years perfecting, leaving him exposed to a terrifying echo of his own long-buried humanity. He had taken her last shield, and in doing so, had stripped himself bare. Now he was left with the ghost of her touch, and the memory of a vulnerability so profound it threatened to undo him. He threw himself into his work with a renewed, vicious intensity, hoping to bury her memory under the rubble of his next corporate demolition. When Ilara visited the hospital, the sterile, hopeful environment felt like a judgment. Her grandmother, frail but with a new light in her eyes, clutched her hand. "The doctors told me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a miracle, Ilara. A true miracle. I knew you were a sensible girl. You found a good man, a protector, someone to take care of you." Each word of praise was a hot brand on Ilara's soul. She smiled, a brittle, fragile thing, the lie a poison on her tongue. The man who had saved her grandmother was not a protector. He was a proprietor who had purchased the most intimate part of her. The sacrifice which had felt so stark and necessary in the desperate hours of the night now felt sullied and complex, a secret that built a new, invisible wall between her and the very person she had fought to save. The silence from Julian was absolute. Days bled into a week, then two, each one a fresh layer of confirmation that she had been nothing more than a problem solved, an account closed. The lack of contact was not a gentle fading away, but a deliberate surgical amputation. He had cut her out of his life with the same cold precision he used to dismantle companies. The silence was his final statement, reinforcing that the flicker of shared humanity she thought she'd seen in his eyes was merely a trick of the light, a projection of her own desperate need for connection. She worked relentlessly, her hands moving with a frantic, punishing rhythm, stitching torn pages and reinforcing broken spines, trying to impose order on the chaos he had unleashed within her. The quiet of her workshop became a torment, amplifying the memory of his whispered confession and the profound emptiness of his absence. Yet, in the desolate landscape of her guilt and loneliness, a strange and unfamiliar seedling began to push its way through the cracked earth of her soul. A quiet resilience. She had stepped into the heart of the fire she had spent her entire life avoiding, and she had not been incinerated. The transgression that she believed would shatter her had, in a paradoxical way, forged her into something stronger. By breaking every rule she had lived by confronting the ghost of her sister's fate and choosing her own path, she had survived. The fear that had been her constant companion for years began to loosen its grip. She started to see that her self-imposed prison of safety had been just as destructive as any passionate flame. This new strength was a quiet, internal dawn, a realization that she was the author of her own story, not just the restorer of others. Julian, meanwhile, waged war on the softness she had awakened in him. He orchestrated the most ruthless takeover of his career, a brutal and calculated corporate assassination that left the financial world reeling. He was trying to exorcise her ghost with an onslaught of cold, hard numbers and merciless strategy. He moved through his life like a phantom, his interactions brief, transactional, and devoid of warmth. He was deliberately, methodically rebuilding the fortress she had breached, reinforcing the walls with cynicism and ambition. But her memory was an insurgency he could not quell. It ambushed him in the silent hours of the night, in the reflection of the woman in the street who had her quiet grace, in the scent of rain on hot pavement. He was a man haunted, punishing the world for the crime of making him feel again, and punishing himself most of all. One brisk autumn afternoon, their separate worlds collided for a fleeting, heart-stopping instant. As she was leaving a supplier's shop, she saw his car, the midnight blue Aston Martin, parked at the curb. He emerged, his tall frame encased in a perfectly tailored suit, a king in his domain. He was on the phone, his expression severe, his voice a low, commanding growl. As he turned, his gaze swept across the street and snagged on hers. For a fraction of a second, the world stopped. She saw a flicker of something. In his eyes, shock, recognition, something akin to pain, before the mask of cold indifference slammed back down. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, turned his back, and strode into a towering skyscraper without a second glance. The brief encounter left her breathless, the chasm between their lives feeling wider and more impassable than ever. That evening, sorting through a box of old family belongings, Ilara found a faded photograph of Lily. Her sister was beaming, her arms wrapped around her lover, her head thrown back in a fit of pure, unadulterated laughter. For years, Ilara had viewed this picture as a tragic prologue, the before to a devastating after. But now, seeing it through new eyes, she saw only life. She saw a woman who had dared to love with her entire being, who had chosen a vibrant, passionate existence over a long, quiet one. She realized with a sudden, painful clarity that she had spent her life mourning her sister's choice instead of celebrating her sister's life. The passion had not been Lily's flaw, it had been her gift. In that moment of quiet revelation, a wave of forgiveness washed over her, for Lily, for her grandmother, and finally, for herself. Her grandmother came home, The apartment, once a shrine to impending loss, was now filled with the quiet, hopeful sounds of recovery. As Ilara brewed tea and plumped pillows, she felt a profound sense of an ending and a beginning. The unpayable debt had been settled, her duty fulfilled. The girl who had made that desperate bargain in the dead of night was gone, replaced by a woman forged in a crucible of fear and desire. Later, she stood at her own window, looking out at the same city that Julian surveyed from his glass tower. The glittering lights no longer seemed like cold, distant stars in an alien world. They looked like a constellation of possibilities. The future was a blank, unbound book, its pages waiting. And for the first time in her life, Ilara Vance felt ready to pick up the pen and write her own story. Months had passed, and the city had shed its winter skin. Spring arrived not with a sudden burst, but with a quiet, persistent green that pushed its way through the cracks in the old cobblestones. In her workshop, bathed in the soft, hopeful light of the new season, Ilara was working on a project unlike any other. She was not mending a broken story, she was creating a vessel for a new one. With hands that no longer trembled, she stitched together clean, blank pages of thick, creamy paper. She worked a piece of soft, supple leather, the color of a stormy sky just before the sun breaks through, tooling it not with gilded flourishes but with a single, simple design. It was a journal, bound by her own hands for her own thoughts. The workshop, once her fortress against the world, had become her launching point into it. The memory of Julian was no longer a fresh, agonizing wound, but a scar she had learned to carry, a permanent part of her own remaking. A courier arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a jarring note of modern efficiency in the quiet rhythm of her day. He handed her a flat, rectangular package wrapped in simple brown paper, the only adornment her name, written across the front, in a sharp, elegant script that made her breath catch in her throat. There was no return address, but none was needed. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs as she carried the package to her workbench, the place where her life had both shattered and been rebuilt. Her fingers, steady just moments before, now trembled as she tore away the paper. Inside, nestled in a bed of dark velvet, was a book. It was a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets, bound in worn, dark blue leather, the very collection her grandmother had loved, the book that had been a silent witness to her life before him. It was a priceless, impossible gesture, a communication in the only language he seemed to truly trust, a transaction of immense, unspoken value. Tucked between the fragile, time-worn pages was a single piece of heavy cardstock, identical to the one he had given her on the night of the accident. It felt like a lifetime ago. She slid it out, her gaze falling upon a few short lines of stark black ink. It was his handwriting, decisive, controlled, yet with an almost imperceptible tremor in the final stroke. It was not an apology, nor a declaration of love. It was something far more raw, more honest. "You mend what is broken," it read. "I have only ever known how to tear things down. I find myself wondering if it is a skill that can be learned." The words were a key, unlocking the final, most heavily guarded door to his soul. It was a confession of his own damage, a quiet admission of his profound loneliness, and a tentative, terrifying question posed across the chasm of silence he had created between them. She traced the shape of the letters, feeling the ghost of his touch, the weight of his own unpayable debt. She stood by her window, the priceless book held gently in her hands, its physical weight a grounding presence. Outside, the spring afternoon was alive with motion. Children chased each other down the cobblestone street, their laughter echoing off the old brick facades. A young couple walked hand in hand, lost in their own shared world. For a long moment she considered her choices. She could place the book on the highest shelf, a beautiful, perfect artifact from a closed chapter of her life. She could accept his gesture as a final, elegant settlement of their spiritual accounts and continue forward on the path she had forged for herself, free and unencumbered. That would be the safe choice, the logical conclusion. The old Ilara, the girl who lived in fear of emotional wreckage, would have seen it as the only option. But that girl was a ghost, a character in a story that had already been told, and she was no longer its curator. She did not pick up the phone. An exchange of such magnitude could not be confined to the disembodied realm of voices and wires. Instead, she placed the rare book of poetry carefully on her workbench and picked up the blank journal she had just finished binding. With the smooth, empty book clutched in her hand, she put on her coat and walked out of the quiet sanctuary of her workshop, locking the door behind her. She began to walk, her steps sure and steady, leaving the familiar, winding streets of the historic district behind. She moved toward the heart of the city, toward the cold, glittering canyons of glass and steel. This was the same journey she had once made in terror and desperation, a supplicant entering a king's domain. Today she walked not as a debtor, but as an equal, a woman with her own story held firmly in her hands, ready to meet another person at the intersection of their two broken narratives. She stopped at the foot of his building, the skyscraper a pillar of mirrored glass that seemed to hold the setting sun captive. She did not feel small or insignificant beneath its immense shadow. She simply looked up, her gaze traveling the impossible height to the place where she knew he was watching the world. She held the blank journal to her chest, its empty pages a promise, a testament to a future yet to be written. Her expression was calm, a quiet sea after a violent storm, filled not with certainty, but with a profound and hopeful resolve. She was no longer a character in a tragedy penned by her past, nor a clause in a contract. Written by him, she was the author. What would happen next in the space between his confession and her arrival was the first blank page. If this story of a woman finding her own voice in the silence of a broken world has touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share. Let us know in the comments what you believe the first sentence of her new chapter should be.